Can we really ditch fossil fuels by replacing them with electric vehicles for everyone? For years, we've been promised a sparkling clean energy future powered by net zero and electric vehicles. The world and human health are negatively impacted by climate change, which is mostly caused by greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. Many European nations have plans in place to transition to electric vehicles and reduce emissions by 2050 because transportation is a major source of these emissions. But there are also a lot of obstacles to overcome in the shift, such as the need to rethink supply networks, the lack of raw resources, and the effects on infrastructure, employment, mobility, and technology. The timeline set forth by our governments for the switch to EVs and net zero will never be met. Despite the hype, hurdles remain. Even EV enthusiasts acknowledge that achieving net zero by 2030 or 2050 requires addressing critical issues with electric vehicles. One major contributing factor is mining, which is unable to provide the necessary quantity of raw materials for this transformation within the suggested time frame. There's an apparent belief that a whole fleet of electric cars and trucks will be seamlessly integrated into the electric grid without the need for enormously costly infrastructure changes. They forget about all the new gadgets and ways we'll use electricity. Data centers are popping up everywhere, and what about heating our homes when natural gas is gone? Anyone who thinks that any of this may happen by 2050 is simply dreaming. It's not going to occur. Mining restrictions are a major source of concern. The capacity of mining to provide all the raw materials needed for a net zero transition by 2050 just doesn't exist, not even close. Consider copper an essential component of EV batteries, wind turbines, and nearly anything electrical, even disregarding the necessity for diesel to power all of that mining. We would need to mine more copper between now and 2050, that is, in less than 25 years, than has ever been done on the Earth during human history. Please let us know how this will be accomplished when mines take 10 years or longer to establish, but no one in authority is interested in looking into this. They seem to be expecting anything to happen magically as they stroll around humming songs while putting their fingers in their ears. Honestly, they could care less. Before anything bad happens, they'll retire, leaving someone else to clean up the mess. Electric vehicles are powering a cleaner future, one charged right at a time. Grid balancing plays a major role there. Maintaining a steady balance between the supply and demand of electricity is the aim of grid balancing. In order to satisfy demand immediately and avoid outages, utilities that are unable to balance their local networks in the short term must purchase energy on the energy markets, which is a costly OPEX proposition. Long-term grid balancing to avoid disruptions necessitates a large CAPEX investment to replace current infrastructure. The EV sector is concerned about maintaining grid balance since the demand for EV charging has plagued an undue strain on the system. Alternative strategies are being adopted by e-mobility providers in order to circumvent investing in significant modifications to the power grid. Since most cars are kept in parks during the days, employing EVs as batteries on wheels or distributed energy sources can reduce the load on the grid and help achieve grid balance. When demand is at its highest, vehicles as batteries can supply energy to the grid through vehicle-to-grid or V2G, and when demand is at its lowest, the batteries can be recharged. V2G can be used anywhere parked vehicles will be spending more than a few hours. In office buildings, for example, drivers can register for V2G participation, noting the time they will need the vehicle. The grid draws on the vehicle's stored energy and then directs energy back to the vehicle to recharge the battery so it's ready for usage when needed. Similarly, EV owners can use their vehicles to power their homes during hours of peak demand and set the vehicle to recharge during hours of non-peak demand, such as early morning hours. And now, let's turn our heads to smart energy management. Distributing available electricity to electric vehicles and other connected power consumers is known as smart energy management. It uses near real-time load management to balance demand throughout the day, which makes it simpler to get above micro-local grid capacity constraints without requiring costly grid upgrades. The optimal smart energy management system controls the dynamic allocation of energy to and from the grid using energy management algorithms that have been properly adjusted. The infrastructure for EV charging is optimized when energy usage is managed, tracked, and adjusted in real time. Reports say that the grid is a different topic. It simply simply will not occur. Biden's EV mandate is based purely on imaginary infrastructure. Will they build it if you pay? Regarding the infrastructure required for electric vehicle charging in order to support the objective of an all-EV future, that's one question the Biden administration ought to have asked itself. Public EV charging stations along U.S. roads are one well-known example of a failed infrastructure project for which the Inflation Reduction Act provided $7.5 billion. Since the IRA was signed over 2 years ago, only 8 charging stations have been erected as a result of that federal generosity. According to Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, the U.S. will require 500,000 of these stations by 2030. We'll need to create over 90,000 stations a year in order to complete the remaining 499,992 stations. That's over 10 each hour, or about 250 per day for the next 51 and a half years. Buttigieg asserted that the majority of EV owners would charge their vehicles at home, possibly realizing the ridiculousness of this building speed. Perhaps, but a number of states, such as California and New York, together with the Environmental Protection Agency, have mandated that all big trucks which move most of our goods, including food, have to switch to electric vehicles as well. Therefore, in the imagined EV future, vacationers won't consider a lack of public charging facilities to be a minor annoyance. It really may come down to life or death. One facet of the urgent requirement for EV charging infrastructure is the lack of public charging stations. Additionally, the Secretary stated that creating charging stations involves more than just burying a tiny gadget. He's accurate. There's much more to it than that, and not much of it is talked about. For instance, even if we're able to construct more producing capacity to generate the electricity required by those EVs, hundreds of thousands of miles of new transmission lines will still be required in order to transport it. They will extend to the local distribution utilities that supply electricity to residences and commercial buildings, in addition to public charging stations situated beside roadways. To put things into perspective, in the US, only 500 miles of new transmission lines were finished in 2022. The roughly 3,000 municipal electric utilities in the country, which run the poles and wires down streets that supply electricity to individual houses, apartments, and businesses, will need to undergo significant renovations in order to handle the higher loads from millions of EV chargers. This implies that high-capacity wires will need to be used to repair millions of miles of local power lines. The majority of the projected 60 to 80 million electrical transformers will need to be replaced with bigger, heavier models. To support the additional weight, bigger utility poles will need to be installed. To meet the electrical demand of the individual EV charging stations, thousands of new transformer lines will need to be constructed alongside U.S. highways. Each transformer line will cost as much as a contemporary steel factory. And here's the point at which the raw materials issue and the infrastructure issue come together. In essence, transformers consist of 2 enormous copper wire coiled encircling a metal core. They have the ability to convert high transmission line voltages to the low voltages required for our dwellings. However, there's an issue with those as well. However, transformers are scarce, particularly the large ones needed for public EV charging stations. A national security concern has been raised by some utilities who claim to have had to wait up to 5 years for the delivery of these massive transformers, the most of which are made in Asia, due to the Department of Energy's mandate that new transformers utilize an increasingly expensive and novel type of specialized electrical steel. Copper is also needed for transformers. EVs need nearly 4 times as much copper as do traditional cars. Roughly 80% of the copper used in the US is already imported. The demand for new transformers will force the country to either greatly expand its reliance on foreign sources or drastically increase domestic copper mining, which has been dropping for years and is opposed by many environmentalists. In any case, given the quantity needed for everything, copper prices will rise, and it will also become quite rare. And how often do you hear government officials genuinely talking about these issues? The practical constraints on the fantastical world they've created for themselves are disregarded because it's simply too difficult to consider. Politicians are blatantly neglecting their duties when they choose to overlook these problems and continue as usual, squandering trillions of taxpayer funds in the process. To put it simply, it's scandalous. However, we'll tell you one thing: realism is the only thing that ever triumphs when fantasy and reality confront. Furthermore, this terrible net zero proposal will have very ugly consequences. Well guys, that's all for this video. Will this stay a dream? Do let us know your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more information.